This video is about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, about the music that influenced them and about the profound effect that they have had on popular music since the 1960s. When American troops were in Great Britain during World War II, they brought with them American popular music. By the late 1950s, the Brits were well acquainted with American traditions of the blues, the slightly newer rhythm and blues, and early rock and roll music. Artists such as Elvis, Chuck Berry, B.B. King, and Ray Charles were at the top of the UK charts. Now, one British style at the time was skiffle, which was a merging of folk and big band sounds. Remember, there's also a folk revival going on among college students in the United States in the 60s. These were college students who had outgrown the teeny bopper music of Elvis and other early rock and rollers. Another British style important in the late 50s and early 60s was the Mersey beat music, which took skiffle sounds and added a backbeat and the driving subdivision of all the beats of rock and roll. One group that was playing this skiffle music was the Quarrymen of Liverpool, seen here in a 1957 photograph. As many of you undoubtedly know, in 1960 the Quarrymen changed their name to the Beatles, and they headed to Hamburg, Germany, where they played on and off for about the next couple of years. Back in Liverpool in 1962, they brought in drummer Ringo Starr and arrived at the definitive Beatles ensemble. They had John Lennon as a lead singer, guitarist, and songwriter, Paul McCartney, who was playing mostly bass and also some guitar, and increasingly becoming the group's primary songwriter and artistic director. George Harrison was their lead guitarist. In Liverpool, the Beatles played often at the Cavern Club. Also extremely important for the band was their manager, Brian Epstein, who has sometimes been called the fifth Beatle. This team in place in 1963, the Lennon-McCartney song I Want to Hold Your Hand was released and almost immediately hit #1 in the United Kingdom. Capitol Records, the American subsidiary of the Beatles label, which was EMI, was reticent to release the Beatles music in the United States. They didn't expect Americans to pay attention to a bunch of British mop tops. Epstein, however, arranged for some playtime on the radio in late '63, and when American audiences proved very interested in I Want to Hold Your Hand, Capitol Records rushed to release it, and it quickly sold 1 million copies and hit #1 on the US pop charts. The timing for this could not have been better. It's estimated that 3,000 fans were on hand to welcome the Beatles at New York City's John F. Kennedy Airport when they arrived in February of 1964. Thus starts the British invasion. The Beatles' performance on the Ed Sullivan TV show just after arriving was watched by an estimated 73 million viewers. That is about 34% of the American population at the time. Songs such as I Want to Hold Your Hand captured the hearts of American teenage girls in particular. The lyrics are sweet and innocuous, celebrating the simple pleasures of holding your lover's hand. The music is equally simple and catchy. Most of the verses end with the same I Want to Hold Your Hand refrain and use the same simple melody. There are a couple of contrasting verses with contrasting music, and also there's some contrast in how it's sung. The Beatles sing the first part of each verse in unison, and they split into close harmonies for the refrains. You can hear the backbeat and constant subdivision of the beat played by the drummer Ringo Starr. Hand claps also add a light-hearted feel to the recorded version of the song. Make sure to listen to this single on your playlist. Before talking more about the Beatles, we'll say a few words about their alter egos, the Rolling Stones. If the Beatles, especially in their early years, were the cute kids in suits who any girl might bring home to her parents, the Rolling Stones were the bad boys of British rock. Formed in 1962, they were comprised of Mick Jagger, vocals and guitar, Brian Jones on guitar and harmonica, Keith Richards on voice and guitars, Bill Wyman on bass, and Charlie Watts on drums. They were particularly inspired by American blues, especially the Chicago blues, and artists such as Muddy Waters, and you more than likely recognize that their name comes from Muddy Waters' song, The Rolling Stone. The Rolling Stones played mostly covers for a couple years until the songwriting team of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards started turning out more songs. Jagger's and Richards' This Is the Last Time was the first composition of theirs to reach #1 in the UK. The Stones' most favorite hit is by far I Can't Get No Satisfaction. The words of the song generally talk about being disenchanted with life. They also most likely allude to a failure to achieve sexual satisfaction. This sexual innuendo has created controversy and continues to create controversy about the song. However, probably, at least at the time, it was more helpful than harmful in establishing the song's popularity. I Can't Get No Satisfaction hit #1 on the charts around the world. It currently sits as #2 on Rolling Stone magazine's 2004 list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. As you listen to it with a listening guide, make sure to notice its famous opening riff. The alternation of solo and group singing is also important, and its repetitive and narrow-ranged melody. You might also hear some call and response between the singing and the guitar, and also hear that it is in a very simple verse form. Now back to the Beatles. After keeping up an exhausting touring schedule for several years, playing for audiences who increasingly couldn't hear their band's music over their own screaming, the Beatles shifted their attention to the recording studio in late 1966. In spaces such as London's Abbey Road studio, they worked with their new producer, George Martin. Inside a studio, which could be very controlled, multiple takes of a song could be made. At this time, the Abbey Road studio had a 4-track recorder, and the tracks could be cut then and layered in different ways. Larger and more diverse types of performing forces could also be used. With the shift to studio recording, rock becomes more musically ambitious. In addition to bringing in entire symphony orchestras, producers could hire an increasing number of instruments from around the world, such as Indian harps and tabla drums. Keyboards such as the Mellotron could synthesize simple imitations of flutes, strings, organ, and brass sounds. Recorded non-musical sounds from alarm clocks and creaking doors and animal noises were also increasingly inserted into recordings. Whereas earlier the single had been the chief unit for popular music, in the 60s more and more groups started producing albums. Albums had initially consisted of several discs, gathered into something that looked like an old-fashioned photo album. With the rise of longer playing records in the late 40s and 50s, an album might consist of only 1 or 2 discs. For a while, these longer playing records were mostly reserved for classical compositions that might last 30 minutes or longer. With the rise of studio recording, however, pop groups increasingly collected songs, issuing them together. The longer album format allowed musicians to put together songs that conceptually fit more and more together, and more groups started issuing what we now call concept albums. A pretty good example of a concept album is the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band of 1967. This is probably also rock music's most influential album ever. Rolling Stone certainly thinks so. Paul McCartney thought up the idea of recording an album, such as this one, that would represent the performance of a fictional band, the Beatles' alter egos, so to speak. The Beatles started with the title track to introduce the band and then continued with a song entitled With a Little Help from My Friends. The album ends with a reprise of the Sgt. Pepper's title track and A Day in the Life. Although Lennon and the other Beatles repeatedly stressed that the songs in between could have appeared on any album, the issue has often been called the first rock concept album. Its album art and packaging supports such a nomination. In addition to the psychedelic neon colors and creative images, the booklet included outlines of a mustache, stripes, and badges that the owner could cut out and don so that he too looked like a member of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Although I'd encourage you to listen to the entire album on your playlist, definitely listening to the Sgt. Pepper's Reprise and A Day in the Life with your listening guide on the course website. Listen for the changing performance forces from rock band to folk rock to symphony orchestra, and also listen for the insertion of non-musical sounds. See if you can hear the dissonant tone clusters, which are finally resolved by the closing chord. Finally, notice the trippy, almost psychedelic lyrics that are matter-of-fact about the sensational and dramatic about the mundane. Although certainly dominant, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were not the only important voices in 60s pop and rock. We have already talked about changes in pop and rock with the circa 1959 exit of rock and rollers such as Elvis, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. We also talked about the payola scandal, in which important disseminators of 50s pop and rock, Alan Freed and Dick Clark, were embroiled. A third change in pop and rock about this time resulted from what might be called the rise of the producer. Record producers had been powerful individuals since the beginning of commercial recording. They saw that developing a process that would turn out as many hit recordings for as little money as possible would be in their best interest. One headquarters for this was Alden Music, which was located in the Brill Building in New York City. There, songwriting partnerships such as Gerry Goffin and Carole King set to work every morning, coming up with catchy words and suitable music for new songs. At the end of each day, all these teams would be gathered into a room for the presentation of their work, and executives would choose which tunes to match up with the musicians they represented. On your screen, you see Don Kirshner, one of the owners, directors of Alden Music, together with Carole King and Gerry Goffin. You also see the gilded entrance to the Brill Building. Other songwriters had more freedom, at least eventually. Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller's contract with Atlantic Records allowed them to work with other producers and allowed them to write and self-produce the 1959 hit There Goes My Baby with the Second Drifters group. Still, the division of labor that increasingly separated performing musicians from composing musicians was perceived by some as inauthentic and as leading to musical demise. The final songwriter-producer that we have time to discuss in this video is Phil Spector. The flamboyant Phil Spector started by writing songs for Gold Star Studios in Hollywood. By 1960, he had started apprenticing with Leiber Stoller in New York City. From there, he went on to do his own productions, many back at the Gold Star Studios in LA. Spector's first big hit was Be My Baby. He wrote this for the Ronettes, and it made it to number 2 on the pop charts and number 4 on the R&B charts. You can hear a bit of Spector's signature wall of sound in this recording. The wall of sound consisted of the use of multiple instruments, such as a full symphony orchestra, playing the same parts and recorded with only a few number of mics. The result is a complex mass of sound that comes across as rich even when played on AM radio and monophonic recordings. Spector also made use of the echo chambers at the Gold Star Studios, which consisted of empty basement rooms into which the studio sound was piped and then piped out to the control room where it could be mixed. This added a lot of resonance to the sound and also enhanced that unique Spector sound. As we'll see, the wall of sound was very different than the multi-tracking approach that became popular with the stereo releases of the 1970s and later. We end with a couple of screens of review questions. As always, I'll pause for a few seconds, during which time you can pause your video and read the questions and review your notes and try to answer the questions. I'll then reveal the answers. So go ahead and pause your video now. Okay, Dr. Kramer back with some answers. Gerry Leiber's songwriting partner was Mike Stoller. King and Goffin worked for Alden Music in the Brill Building. And early rock and roll is best dated between 1954 and 1959. Here's the final screen of review questions for this video. Go ahead and pause your video now. The answers are, all are important to early rock and roll except scat. Second answer, Chuck Berry wrote rock and roll music. And that question may or may not be on the exam depending on what is covered in your syllabus. You can double check that. And then finally, the Payola scandal included DJs Alan Freed and Dick Clark. See you next time.